Thinking Fast and Slow is a monster of a book, nearly 600 pages, but you're about to learn the entire thing in one single video. All 38 chapters, step by step, unless you're a filthy quitter, but you're not. So let's dive in. Part 1. Two Systems. Chapter 1. The Characters of the Story. Let's start with the foundation of Daniel Kahneman's thinking, Fast and Slow. The two systems of thought, System 1 and System 2. Imagine System 1 as your autopilot. It operates quickly, effortlessly, and intuitively. It's what kicks in when you recognize a friend's face in a crowd or react instinctively to avoid a falling object. On the other hand, System 2 is your deliberate problem solver. It steps in when you're solving a math problem, planning your budget, or learning a new skill. These two systems constantly interact, shaping how we think and make decisions. However, as Kahneman emphasizes, System 1 often dominates because it's easier to use. This dominance can lead to cognitive biases, errors in thinking, because System 1 sometimes jumps to conclusions or oversimplifies. For example, you might quickly judge someone's character based on a single interaction, not realizing that this snap judgment could be flawed. To balance these systems, mindfulness is key. Start by recognizing when System 1 is in charge, like when you're making a snap decision, and ask whether the situation warrants deeper analysis. Engage System 2 for critical decisions by giving yourself time to think and minimizing distractions. Over time, you can train System 2 through activities like puzzles or deliberate practice, strengthening your ability to approach challenges thoughtfully. Please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Chapter 2. Attention and Effort. Kahneman makes it clear that System 2 is resource-intensive. It demands attention and energy, which is why we often avoid using it unless absolutely necessary. Think about the last time you tried to focus on a difficult task after a long day. Your brain probably resisted because attention is a limited resource. This laziness of System 2 allows System 1 to take the reins more often, even in situations where deliberate thinking would be better. For instance, when faced with a tricky decision, you might rely on gut instinct simply because engaging System 2 feels exhausting. This tendency can lead to errors, especially in complex or unfamiliar scenarios. To manage your mental energy wisely, conserve System 2 for the moments that truly matter. Schedule important tasks when you're mentally fresh, maybe in the morning or after a short break. Use mental cues like asking, "Why do I believe this?" to engage System 2 deliberately, and limit distractions. A quiet, focused environment can make all the difference when tackling challenging problems. Chapter 3. The Lazy Controller. Kahneman takes this idea further in the next chapter, showing that System 2 not only requires effort, but is inherently lazy. It often defaults to accepting the suggestions of System 1, even when they're wrong. This laziness can be a problem when self-control or discipline is needed. Imagine trying to stick to a diet. You see a tempting dessert, and before you know it, System 1 is rationalizing why just one bite is okay. System 2 could step in to remind you of your long-term goals, but if you're tired or distracted, it might not bother. This is why so many of our bad habits persist. They exploit the natural laziness of System 2. To counteract this, focus on building habits that reduce the need for constant self-control. For example, pre-plan meals or keep tempting foods out of sight. Delay important decisions until you're rested and alert, and train yourself to pause and question automatic judgments. With consistent practice, you'll find it easier to resist impulses and make deliberate choices. Chapter 4. The Associative Machine. Kahneman introduces the idea of the associative machine, which is essentially how System 1 creates connections between ideas. This process is incredibly fast and intuitive. For example, hearing the word summer might instantly bring to mind beaches, ice cream, or a favorite memory. These associations make life easier by helping us interpret the world quickly, but they also have a downside. System 1 often forces patterns onto unrelated information. For instance, you might connect two events and assume one caused the other, simply because they occurred close in time. This is how superstitions or inaccurate beliefs are formed. The associative machine is powerful, but it can lead to flawed conclusions when unchecked. To avoid falling into this trap, take the time to slow down and analyze your intuitive responses. especially in high-stakes situations. Ask yourself, what evidence supports this connection? Challenge overly simplistic narratives with alternative explanations, and cultivate a habit of questioning your assumptions to ensure that your conclusions are based on fact, not just intuition. Chapter 5. Cognitive ease. Let's explore the concept of cognitive ease, a key feature of System 1 thinking. Cognitive ease is that sense of comfort we feel when a thought or task flows effortlessly. Kahneman points out that when our minds feel at ease, we're more likely to believe things are going well. For example, when you see a familiar logo or read a clearly written article, you instinctively trust the information more. However, this ease can be deceptive. It often leads to overconfidence and prevents us from critically evaluating the truth of what we're encountering. Kahneman highlights that factors like repetition, clear visuals, and simple language can enhance cognitive ease, which advertisers use to make their messages stick. But here's the catch. Just because something is familiar or easy to process doesn't mean it's true. Think about how false information spreads. It often relies on being repeated so many times that it feels familiar and therefore trustworthy. So, how can we use this knowledge? First, simplify your own communication to make your ideas more persuasive. At the same time, don't let familiarity alone convince you of something. Test your assumptions against objective facts. Finally, when making important decisions, slow down and question whether ease is leading you astray. Cognitive ease is a double-edged sword. Understanding it can sharpen your thinking. Chapter 6. Norms, Surprises, and Causes. Next, let's delve into how our minds process surprises. System 1 is particularly adept at noticing when something deviates from the norm. It's like an alarm system for our brain. Surprises grab our attention because they challenge our expectations, forcing us to reassess our understanding of the situation. For example, imagine walking into a familiar room and finding a chair flipped upside down. Your brain would immediately flag this as unusual and try to figure out why. Kahneman explains that while this ability to detect surprises helps us adapt to changes, it also has a downside: our tendency to oversimplify. System 1 often jumps to causal explanations, even when there might be none. For instance, we might assume someone is upset with us because they didn't say hello, overlooking other possibilities like they're being distracted. To improve your judgment, question the causes you assign to unexpected events. Ask yourself whether your explanation holds up under scrutiny. Avoid embracing patterns or stories that feel too neat or convenient. They might just be shortcuts your mind is taking. And finally, make it a habit to revisit your assumptions regularly, ensuring they align with reality. Chapter 7. A machine for jumping to conclusions. Kahneman calls System 1 a machine for jumping to conclusions. This is because System 1 is designed to make quick judgments based on limited information, often to our detriment. Imagine looking at a resume with an Ivy League school listed and assuming the candidate is highly qualified. That snap judgment might ignore other critical factors, like relevant experience or interpersonal skills. The phrase, "what you see is all there is," captures the essence of this tendency. System 1 doesn't pause to wonder what information might be missing. It simply works with what's immediately available. While this approach can save time, it also leads to overconfidence and flawed decisions. To counteract this, actively seek out missing information before jumping to conclusions. Engage System 2 to slow down and analyze whether your initial impressions are supported by evidence. Recognize situations where snap judgments could be harmful, such as hiring decisions or conflict resolution, and give yourself the time to think critically. Chapter 8. How Judgments Happen. Let's discuss how System 1 simplifies complex problems. When faced with a difficult question, System 1 often substitutes it with an easier one without us even realizing it. For example, instead of asking, "Should I invest in this company?" your brain might unconsciously ask, "Do I like this company's CEO?" The simpler question feels easier to answer, but it may lead you to overlook important aspects of the decision. This mechanism, while efficient, is a cognitive shortcut that can lead to significant errors. Kahneman points out that these substitutions are automatic and effortless, which makes them hard to catch in the moment. By understanding this process, we can start to recognize when we're falling into this trap. To avoid substitution, Break down complex decisions into smaller, more manageable parts that engage System 2. Take the time to reflect on whether your judgment matches the original question or if you've inadvertently substituted it with an easier one. By aligning your thought process with the real problem at hand, you'll improve your accuracy and confidence in decision-making. Chapter 9. Answering an easier question. Let's discuss a common mental shortcut discussed by Kahneman, answering an easier question instead of the one actually being asked. System 1 often replaces a complex question with a simpler one, usually without us even realizing it. For instance, if you're asked, "Should I invest in this company?" your brain might unconsciously shift to, "Do I like the CEO?" This substitution feels intuitive, but doesn't address the real question. Kahneman highlights that emotions play a key role in these substitutions, which is why decisions can be influenced by factors like personal biases or initial impressions. This tendency, while efficient, can create significant errors in judgment. By prioritizing ease and coherence, System 1 often overlooks the nuances or complexity of a problem. For example, someone evaluating a policy might base their opinion on how it makes them feel rather than its actual effectiveness. To combat this, you need to pause and reflect. Ask yourself whether the question you're answering is truly the one you were asked. If you find emotional influences creeping in, take a step back and engage System 2 for a more deliberate approach. This habit of mindful questioning can help you avoid oversimplified decisions. Part 2. Heuristics and Biases. Chapter 10. The Law of Small Numbers. Now let's talk about how easily we misinterpret small amounts of data. Kahneman points out that people often draw big conclusions from small sample sizes, which can lead to inaccurate generalizations. For example, if a new product is tested in a focus group of just 5 people, and they all love it, you might assume the product will be universally successful. But small samples are more likely to show extreme results because they don't represent the larger population. This bias often arises because System 1 focuses on the content of the message rather than its reliability. In other words, we're more likely to believe a story if it sounds compelling, even if it's based on flawed data. Kahneman reminds us that small samples are inherently unreliable and should be treated with caution. To improve your decision-making, always consider the size of the data sample and its context. Avoid jumping to conclusions based on limited observations, and seek additional data or evidence to confirm patterns before making decisions. Chapter 11. Anchors. Anchoring is a fascinating bias that demonstrates how our judgments are influenced by initial information, even when it's irrelevant. Imagine you're negotiating a salary, and the first number brought up is $50,000. Even if this number isn't reasonable, it sets a psychological anchor that affects the entire discussion. Kahneman explains that once an anchor is established, people adjust their estimates, but they rarely adjust enough. This effect shows up everywhere, from real estate pricing to courtroom sentencing. For example, studies show that when people are given a high initial price for a product, they're more likely to accept a higher final price, even if the product isn't worth it. To counter anchoring, be mindful of the initial information you're exposed to and question its relevance. In negotiations, you can use anchoring to your advantage by setting a favorable initial number. Finally, when making estimates, challenge yourself to recalibrate based on objective criteria rather than the anchor. Chapter 12. The Science of Availability. Let's explore the availability heuristic, which affects how we judge probabilities and risks. Kahneman explains that events that are vivid, dramatic, or recent come to mind more easily and therefore feel more likely to occur. For example, after seeing news coverage of a plane crash, you might overestimate the risk of flying, even though air travel remains one of the safest modes of transportation. This heuristic is useful in some cases. It helps us quickly assess risks based on past experiences. However, it can also distort our judgment by making rare but memorable events seem more common than they actually are. The media often amplifies this bias by focusing on dramatic stories, which can further skew our perception of reality. To counter this, analyze whether your judgments are based on vivid memories or actual data. Seek out objective information to balance emotionally charged examples. By doing so, you'll make decisions grounded in reality rather than distorted by what's most easily remembered. Please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Chapter 13, Availability, Emotion, and Risk. Let's talk about the relationship between emotions and how we perceive risks. Kahneman explains that our emotions amplify the effects of the availability heuristic, making fear-inducing or emotionally charged events easier to recall and more influential in shaping our judgments. For instance, after watching news coverage of a natural disaster, people may overestimate the likelihood of such events happening to them. This interplay between emotion and memory often leads to irrational fears, or conversely, misplaced overconfidence in rare but vivid successes. A key point here is that vividness and emotion make certain risks feel more significant than they statistically are. Kahneman reminds us that people are more afraid of risks that are vivid and memorable than risks that are statistically significant. To counter this, we need to separate emotional reactions from logical evaluations. For example, instead of focusing on the dramatic imagery of an event, ask yourself, what do the numbers say about the actual risk? Practicing emotional awareness can help you recognize when your fears or excitements are clouding your judgment. Over time, focusing on long-term patterns instead of isolated events will lead to more balanced decision-making. Chapter 14, Tom's Specialty. In this chapter, Kahneman introduces the representativeness heuristic, which occurs when we judge the likelihood of something based on how much it resembles a stereotype, rather than considering the actual probabilities or base rates. For example, if you were told that Tom is quiet and likes books, you might assume he's more likely to be a librarian than a farmer. But statistically, there are far more farmers than librarians, making this assumption flawed. Kahneman emphasizes that we often neglect base rates, the foundational data about how common or rare something actually is, because we're drawn to how well a description matches a stereotype. He writes, "We focus on similarity and overlook base rates. This tendency simplifies complex judgments but often leads to inaccurate predictions. To combat this, start by incorporating statistical data into your decisions. Ask yourself whether your judgments are based on objective evidence or a stereotype. Developing critical thinking habits will help you catch these biases and make more accurate assessments." Chapter 15, Linda. Less is more. Next, let's explore the conjunction fallacy, which Kahneman discusses through the famous example of Linda. Imagine you're told that Linda is passionate about social justice. Is it more likely that Linda is a bank teller, or that she's a bank teller and active in the feminist movement? Most people intuitively choose the second option because it aligns with the narrative they've built about her. However, statistically, it's less probable. There are fewer people who fit two criteria than those who fit just one. This fallacy stems from the representativeness heuristic, as we're drawn to detailed scenarios that feel coherent, even if they're less logical. Kahneman points out, a good story is more persuasive than good logic. The lesson here is to evaluate probabilities with a clear, logical approach. Avoid being swayed by vivid but misleading stories. By questioning assumptions and using statistical reasoning, you can avoid falling into the trap of overvaluing detailed but less probable scenarios. Chapter 16, Causes Trump Statistics. Let's discuss why people tend to prioritize causal stories over statistics. Kahneman explains that humans are naturally drawn to narratives that make sense of events, even when these stories contradict statistical data. For example, if someone succeeds despite overwhelming odds, we might create a causal story about their determination, ignoring the role of luck or randomness. Kahneman writes, causal thinking has an irresistible appeal, even when it contradicts statistical reasoning. This preference for stories can lead to errors, as it oversimplifies complex realities. To counter this, ask yourself whether the causal explanation aligns with the data available. Resist the temptation to accept a story just because it feels satisfying or intuitive. Instead, use evidence-based reasoning and statistical tools to validate or challenge these narratives. Balancing data with storytelling is essential for making sound, informed decisions. Chapter 17, Regression to the Mean. Let's start by discussing regression to the mean, one of the most misunderstood statistical concepts. Kahneman explains that extreme outcomes, whether unusually good or bad, are often followed by less extreme ones simply due to natural variability. For instance, if a baseball player has an outstanding game, they're likely to perform closer to their average in the next one. Not necessarily because they stop trying, but because performance naturally fluctuates. The problem is that we tend to attribute these changes to specific causes, like extra effort or lack thereof, when in reality, it's often just randomness at play. A key takeaway here is that we often misinterpret these regressions, leading to flawed evaluations. For example, praising someone after a peak performance might not guarantee another great result, and punishing someone for a bad day might not be the reason they improve the next day. Kahneman emphasizes, we are prone to invent explanations for regression where none are needed. To avoid this trap, focus on identifying long-term trends instead of reacting to isolated events. Use statistical tools to distinguish between meaningful changes and random fluctuations. Recognizing regression to the mean can help you make fairer evaluations and more informed decisions. Chapter 18. Taming intuitive predictions. Now let's talk about intuitive predictions and why they're often unreliable. Kahneman explains that our intuition tends to overestimate how accurate or precise our forecasts are. For example, if you predict a stock's performance based on a hunch, you might feel confident in your guess without considering how much uncertainty is involved. This overconfidence stems from a lack of discipline in adjusting our predictions based on data or logic. Kahneman writes, "Intuition without discipline is a recipe for error. To improve accuracy, we need to calibrate our predictions using objective criteria, like base rates or statistical data. For instance, instead of guessing how quickly a project will be completed based on optimism, factor in historical data about similar projects. Regularly reviewing your past predictions to see how they compare with actual outcomes is another helpful strategy. By taking a disciplined approach, you can close the gap between intuition and reality, leading to more reliable judgments." Part 3. Overconfidence. Chapter 19. The illusion of understanding. Here we encounter the illusion of understanding. This phenomenon occurs when we create coherent stories to explain complex events, even when we don't fully understand them. Kahneman highlights how hindsight bias plays a major role in this illusion. For example, after a company fails, people might confidently say, "It was obvious they were going to fail," even though that wasn't clear beforehand. These narratives give us a false sense of control and understanding. Kahneman reminds us that the confidence we feel in our beliefs isn't necessarily tied to the quality of evidence supporting them. He writes, "The confidence people feel in their beliefs is not a measure of the quality of evidence." To combat this, challenge your understanding of complex topics by seeking alternative viewpoints. Acknowledge uncertainty instead of oversimplifying. Focus on the quality of the evidence you're using rather than how coherent your explanation feels. By doing this, you'll develop a more balanced and realistic view of the world. Chapter 20. The illusion of validity. Let's look at the illusion of validity, which is closely related to overconfidence in our predictions. Kahneman explains that we often overestimate the reliability of our judgments, even when the evidence is weak or contradictory. For example, a hiring manager might feel sure they can predict a candidate's success based on a single interview, despite knowing how unreliable first impressions can be. This illusion persists because we fail to recognize randomness and the limits of our expertise. Kahneman observes, randomness can masquerade as meaningful patterns. To avoid falling into this trap, test your predictions regularly and measure their accuracy against objective benchmarks. For instance, if you're in sales, track how well your forecasts align with actual outcomes. Embrace humility by recognizing the limits of your knowledge and seeking input from other perspectives. By doing so, you'll reduce the risks of overconfidence and make more thoughtful, data-driven decisions. Chapter 21. Intuitions versus formulas. This presents an idea that challenges our faith in intuition, the power of formulas. Kahneman makes a strong case that simple formulas often outperform expert intuition in tasks like hiring decisions, predicting academic success, or diagnosing medical conditions. The human mind, as he explains, is prone to biases and inconsistencies that formulas or algorithms simply don't have. For example, when deciding whether a candidate is a good fit for a job, relying on a structured scoring system based on objective criteria usually yields better results than gut feelings. Kahneman notes, the human mind is not as consistent or reliable as a formula. This is because intuition can be swayed by irrelevant factors like mood, appearance, or anecdotal evidence, while formulas stick to the data. In high-stakes scenarios, such as making investment decisions or evaluating risks, trusting data-driven systems can lead to significantly better outcomes. This doesn't mean intuition is useless, but we should supplement it with rule-based approaches whenever possible. By comparing intuitive judgments against algorithms, we can identify biases and refine our decision-making processes. Chapter 22. Expert Intuition. When can we trust it? Now let's talk about expert intuition. Kahneman emphasizes that intuition is only reliable in environments with regular patterns and immediate feedback. For example, a firefighter with years of experience might intuitively sense when a building is about to collapse because they've encountered similar situations repeatedly. But in chaotic or novel environments, intuition often falters. Without consistent patterns and feedback, intuition becomes no better than guessing. Kahneman writes, true expertise depends on practice in a predictable environment. In unpredictable settings, such as navigating new markets or dealing with unprecedented crises, analysis should take precedence over gut feelings. To make sound decisions, rely on intuition only when you have extensive experience and consistent feedback to validate your instincts. In uncertain situations, prioritize systematic analysis and data over feelings. Continuously test and validate your intuitive judgments against objective evidence to ensure they hold up under scrutiny. Chapter 23. The Outside View. Let's move on to a critical concept, the outside view. Kahneman explains that most people take an inside view when planning or making decisions. They focus on their unique situation and rely on personal projections. The problem is that this often leads to underestimating challenges and overestimating success. For example, someone planning a home renovation might assume it will take only 3 months, ignoring the countless stories of similar projects that ran late and over budget. The outside view, on the other hand, uses historical data and broader perspectives to counteract this optimism. Kahneman says, the outside view offers a corrective to the optimism of the inside view. By looking at how similar situations have played out in the past, you can set more realistic expectations. Use historical benchmarks to inform your plans and regularly compare your projections against similar cases. Question overly optimistic assumptions and adjust your approach based on evidence, not just hope. This habit can help you avoid the pitfalls of the planning fallacy and lead to better outcomes. Chapter 24. The Engine of Capitalism. Let's explore the role of optimism and overconfidence in driving innovation and economic growth. Kahneman acknowledges that optimism, particularly among entrepreneurs, is a powerful force. Optimistic individuals take risks, start businesses, and push boundaries, which fuels progress. He notes, optimistic individuals play a disproportionate role in shaping our lives. However, this same optimism can blind people to risks, leading to failures or unintended consequences. The planning fallacy, for instance, contributes to the collapse of many ambitious projects. While optimism is essential for progress, it must be balanced with realism. Recognize both the benefits and risks of optimism in your decision-making. Incorporate risk assessments to identify potential pitfalls and create safeguards to manage them. By encouraging innovation while preparing for potential setbacks, you can strike a balance that supports sustainable success. Please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Part 4. Choices. Chapter 25. Bernoulli's Errors. Let's talk about one of the foundational ideas in Kahneman's critique of traditional economic thinking, Bernoulli's errors. Expected utility theory, developed by Bernoulli, assumes that people make rational decisions based on the overall utility or benefit they gain from wealth. However, Kahneman argues that this model doesn't match how we actually think about gains and losses. Instead, people evaluate outcomes relative to a reference point, not as absolute changes in wealth. For example, someone who loses $1,000 after gaining $2,000 might feel worse than someone who simply gained $1,000, even though their final wealth is the same. This chapter introduces the concept of reference points, which explain why our decisions are shaped by where we currently stand, not just the outcome itself. Kahneman notes, "What matters to people is not the state of wealth, but changes from their current position." Understanding this is crucial because it highlights the emotional weight of losses compared to gains, laying the groundwork for prospect theory. To make better decisions, identify your reference points and how they influence your perspective. Reframe situations to focus on long-term goals rather than reacting emotionally to short-term changes. By managing the psychological impact of losses, you'll improve both your clarity and resilience in decision-making. Chapter 26. Prospect Theory. Building on the last chapter, Kahneman introduces prospect theory, a framework that more accurately reflects how people evaluate risks and rewards. Unlike traditional models, prospect theory shows that we're not rational agents making cold calculations. Instead, we perceive outcomes based on perceived gains or losses relative to a reference point. One of its key insights is loss aversion, the idea that losses feel far more painful than equivalent gains feel pleasurable. For example, losing $50 stings much more than finding $50 brings joy. Kahneman writes, "Losses loom larger than gains." This idea helps explain behaviors like why people hold on to losing stocks, hoping they'll bounce back, or why individuals are willing to pay high premiums for insurance to avoid potential losses. Understanding how framing influences decisions is critical. If you reframe a situation to emphasize long-term benefits over immediate discomfort, you can counteract loss aversion. Additionally, by designing policies or incentives that align with this principle, you can encourage better decision-making, whether in your own life or on a broader scale. Chapter 27. The Endowment Effect. Now let's talk about the endowment effect, a bias that stems from loss aversion. Kahneman explains that people tend to overvalue what they already own, making them reluctant to part with it, even if the trade would benefit them. For instance, if you own a coffee mug, you might value it more highly than if you were considering buying the exact same mug from someone else. This is because giving up the mug feels like a loss, and as we've learned, losses carry more emotional weight than gains. Kahneman notes, "The pain of losing exceeds the pleasure of gaining, and this distorts our perception of value." The endowment effect is particularly relevant in markets and negotiations, where emotional attachment to ownership can skew rational decision-making. To counteract this bias, ask yourself whether holding on to an item aligns with your long-term goals. If not, it might be time to let it go. Additionally, understanding this effect can help you in negotiations. Frame your offers in a way that appeals to others' loss aversion, such as emphasizing what they'll gain by accepting your proposal. Chapter 28. Bad Events. Let's explore how negative events disproportionately influence our thinking. Kahneman points out that bad outcomes have a far greater psychological impact than positive ones of equal magnitude. This is known as negativity bias, and it's why we tend to dwell on criticism more than we celebrate praise. He writes, "Bad is stronger than good," and explains that we allocate more attention to threats than opportunities. While this sensitivity to risk might have evolutionary roots, helping us survive, it can lead to overly cautious or defensive decision-making. For example, after a failed project, someone might become overly risk-averse, avoiding new opportunities altogether. The key is to balance this emotional reaction by focusing on the potential for growth or learning. Recognize the impact of negative events, but avoid overreacting or letting them dictate your future decisions. Reframe setbacks as opportunities to learn and improve, rather than threats to avoid. By doing so, you'll build resilience and maintain a more balanced approach to risk. Chapter 29. The Fourfold Pattern. This introduces a concept that challenges how we think about risk. The fourfold pattern of risk preferences. Kahneman explains that our attitudes toward risk depend on two factors: probability and outcomes. This model reveals why we often make decisions that defy rational calculations of expected value. For instance, people might gamble on a lottery ticket with a tiny chance of winning because they overweight the slim probability of a big gain. Conversely, they may avoid a high probability, low-impact loss, like a small fee, despite the odds being in their favor. Kahneman points out high probability events are overweighted, while low probability events are underweighted. This explains seemingly irrational behaviors like why people overpay for extended warranties or take out expensive insurance for unlikely risks. To navigate these tendencies, analyze how probability and outcome framing influence your decisions. Avoid overestimating rare events and instead focus on realistic evaluations of risk and reward. By understanding the fourfold pattern, you can make choices that are better aligned with your long-term goals. Chapter 30. Rare events. Next, let's dive deeper into why rare events hold such power over our decision-making. Kahneman explains that vivid, emotionally charged events, like natural disasters or plane crashes, are more memorable, and thus feel more likely than they truly are. This leads people to overestimate their probability, resulting in behaviors like overpaying for insurance or avoiding activities perceived as dangerous, even when the actual risk is low. For instance, you might fear flying after hearing about a crash, despite the overwhelming safety statistics for air travel. He writes, "The vividness of rare events makes them more likely to dominate our attention. This distortion often causes fear to dictate our actions, leading to irrational decisions. To counter this, evaluate rare events using statistical data instead of emotional reactions. Don't over-insure against unlikely risks unless the potential consequences are catastrophic. Focus instead on strategies that address the most probable outcomes, allowing you to allocate your time and resources more effectively." Chapter 31. Risk policies. Building on the idea of risk, Kahneman emphasizes the importance of developing consistent risk policies. He explains that people often react emotionally to individual outcomes, leading to inconsistent and short-sighted decisions. For example, someone might avoid an investment after a single bad experience, even if the overall strategy is sound. A better approach is to view decisions as part of a broader portfolio, focusing on long-term patterns rather than isolated incidents. A rational risk policy focuses on the overall portfolio, not isolated events, Kahneman notes. By framing your decisions within a larger strategy, you can mitigate the emotional impact of short-term outcomes. Start by creating clear guidelines for evaluating risks, ensuring your approach is consistent across situations. Regularly review and adjust these policies to align with your goals, and always keep the big picture in mind. This disciplined approach fosters rational thinking and long-term success. Chapter 32. Keeping score. Let's explore how we keep score with our finances and decisions. Kahneman introduces the concept of mental accounting, where we categorize money into separate accounts based on its source or intended use. While this simplifies decision-making, it can also lead to irrational behaviors. For instance, you might splurge a bonus on a luxury purchase, even if that money could be better spent reducing debt. Similarly, people often overvalue certain gains, like sentimental items, while undervaluing more practical options. Kahneman writes, "We create mental accounts to simplify decision-making, but these accounts can mislead us. To avoid this trap, treat all financial resources as part of a single, cohesive portfolio. Evaluate your decisions based on their overall impact, not the origin of the money involved." That said, mental accounting can be used intentionally for positive behaviors, such as designating separate savings accounts for specific goals. By understanding and managing this bias, you can make financial choices that align with your long-term priorities. Chapter 33. Reversals. There's an intriguing phenomenon in decision-making: preference reversals. Kahneman shows us how the way choices are framed can significantly influence our decisions, often leading to inconsistencies. For example, people might choose one option when it's presented as a gain, but reverse their preference if the same option is framed as avoiding a loss. The actual outcomes don't change, only the way they're described does. This highlights the power of framing and how it manipulates our preferences. Kahneman writes, The way we present choices often matters more than the choices themselves. Understanding this can help us make more consistent and rational decisions. Start by analyzing options from multiple perspectives to identify potential framing biases. Reframe decisions in ways that align with your long-term goals. And if you're guiding others, use framing intentionally to help them see choices in a constructive and beneficial light. Chapter 34. Frames and Reality. Building on the idea of framing, Kahneman explores how it shapes not just decisions but our perception of reality itself. Frames influence how we interpret events, evaluate outcomes, and even define success or failure. For instance, consider a 90% survival rate versus a 10% mortality rate. They describe the same reality, but the frame shapes how we feel about it. Kahneman emphasizes, by changing the frame, we can change the meaning of an outcome. Recognizing this power allows us to make better decisions and communicate more effectively. For example, when faced with a challenge, you can reframe it as an opportunity for growth rather than a setback. Similarly, in professional settings, framing discussions positively can lead to better collaboration and problem solving. By consciously choosing your frames, you can shape not only how others perceive situations, but also how you approach your own challenges. Part 5. Two Selves. Chapter 35. Two Selves. Now let's dive into one of Kahneman's most thought-provoking ideas, the two selves, the experiencing self and the remembering self. The experiencing self lives in the moment, focusing on what's happening right now, like savoring a meal or enjoying a concert. The remembering self, on the other hand, evaluates life based on memories, particularly highlights, low points, and how experiences end. These two selves often conflict, which leads to discrepancies in how we perceive happiness. Kahneman writes, "We do not choose between experiences. We choose between memories of experiences." This explains why people might endure a difficult vacation if it ends well, as the remembering self dominates life decisions. To align your choices with true well-being, focus on creating positive experiences while also being mindful of how they'll be remembered. Recognize the importance of endings. Whether it's a meal, a relationship, or a project, aim to conclude things on a positive note. Balancing the needs of both selves will help you find deeper satisfaction in life. Chapter 36. Life as a Story. Continuing this theme, Kahneman discusses how we naturally interpret our lives as stories. We seek coherence and meaning in our experiences, often focusing on a few standout moments and the way things end. This storytelling tendency can distort the full reality of an experience. For instance, a difficult year with a happy ending might feel more positive in retrospect than a mostly great year that ends badly. Kahneman reminds us, a good ending can redeem even a difficult experience. Understanding this narrative approach allows us to craft more fulfilling life stories. Reflect on the stories you tell yourself about your life. Do they align with your values and aspirations? Focus on meaningful experiences and strive to end them positively, whether it's a conversation, a project, or a phase of life. By using storytelling principles intentionally, you can inspire yourself and others, turning even challenging moments into opportunities for growth and meaning. Chapter 37. Experienced Well-Being. Let's begin with the concept of experienced well-being, how we feel moment to moment in our daily lives. Kahneman emphasizes that well-being isn't solely tied to income or material wealth. While money can provide comfort and opportunities, its impact on happiness diminishes after meeting basic needs. Instead, well-being is deeply influenced by how we spend our time and the quality of our relationships. For instance, spending time with loved ones or engaging in meaningful activities often contributes far more to happiness than a higher paycheck. Kahneman explains, happiness depends more on how people spend their time than on their income. This highlights the importance of prioritizing joyful and fulfilling pursuits. To enhance your well-being, focus on activities that bring you both pleasure and meaning. Cultivate relationships that nourish your emotional and social needs, as they're a cornerstone of long-term happiness. Strive for balance by aligning your daily experiences with long-term goals, ensuring that your time is spent on what truly matters. Please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Chapter 38. Thinking about life. Now, let's shift to how we think about our lives as a whole. Kahneman explores the role of reflective thinking, how we evaluate our experiences and use those evaluations to shape our future decisions. The remembering self plays a key role here, as it tends to overshadow the experiencing self. This means that we judge our lives based on memories of significant moments rather than the day-to-day reality of how we feel. For example, we might look back on a challenging year positively if it concluded with a meaningful accomplishment, even if much of the year felt difficult. Kahneman reminds us, we think about life through the lens of our remembering self. To achieve true well-being, it's crucial to align daily experiences with meaningful goals. Regularly reflect on whether your activities and choices are moving you toward the life you want. Balance immediate pleasures with purpose-driven pursuits, ensuring both selves are satisfied. Practicing gratitude can further enhance your perspective, helping you appreciate the present while staying connected to your larger aspirations. In Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman explores the dual systems that govern human thought. System 1 operates automatically and intuitively, relying on heuristics to make quick judgments. System 2, in contrast, is deliberate and analytical, but requires significant effort and energy. Kahneman examines how these systems interact, often leading to cognitive biases such as overconfidence, loss aversion, and susceptibility to framing effects. Through detailed research, he reveals why our decision-making is frequently irrational and how understanding these tendencies can improve choices. Kahneman concludes that while we cannot fully escape biases, we can mitigate their impact by engaging System 2 for critical decisions and using strategies like reframing and considering base rates. By understanding the mechanics of thought, we gain tools to navigate complex choices more effectively. Ultimately, the book offers a framework for thinking more clearly and making more informed decisions. I hope you enjoyed